So yeah, let me start with the intermediate DataWeave 2.0. Yeah, I named it intermediate because it's what I'm gonna present today is not really that technical, not that advanced, but it's also not very basic. So I'm gonna talk about the DataWeave playground, about using an output that is called application DataWeave. In case you didn't know about that, I didn't know about that until I took a training, and it's pretty awesome. So I thought of sharing this with you guys. Um, Also, some different ways of calling functions, some different ways of concatenating things, and using null checkers. If you are familiar with DataWeave, you probably already know how to do some of these. But in case you don't, these can be pretty useful. So I'm gonna start with the DataWeave Playground. If you haven't heard of it, it's basically just a, a local server that, well, a Docker image that you can run in your local computer, and you will have through the browser, you are able to see just the transformation part. So you don't have to go to Anypoint Studio and open a new project and create a new transform message component. You can just go to this playground and you can play around with DataWeave. So all this presentation is based on that DataWeave playground. In case it seems a little bit odd for you, that's because of that. You can download it from the link there in Docker Hub, and you can search for, in the tags, you can search for the versions 2 and 1. Yes, I will share the presentation at the end, but I can also share you the link in some minutes. You can also go to dwl.mule.club and you will be able to see it right from there. So there's no need to download the Docker image if you want to use the version 2, because the version 2 is right here in this link. But if you want to use a version 1, you do have to download the Docker image for the version 1, because at least I don't know of any link that has available the version 1. And so what is this application DataWeave thing? So you know here in the output how you write output application JSON or XML or CSV or whatever. You can also write application/DW, and it can give you like the internal data, like how DataWeave is processing all these data underneath everything, right? So for example, you can just write output application DW and write a function, and you will be able to see here in the output, how is that function working? You can see the arguments, the first argument, the second argument, and any output if it's available to see. If not, you will just see this. Oh, awesome. Thank you, Manik. I didn't know about that one. So Manik just sent the DataWeave 1 playground, that there's also a link for that. Thank you. And yeah, so a note that's very important for this part is do not deploy your application with this application DW output. The performance will be affected. So it's not, it's useful for when you want to see the output and how is everything working underneath, but it's not very useful if you want to have it for your future transformations. So just put it there and try out whatever you want to see in the preview, and then remove it and put application JSON or whatever your data structure is. And then you can call functions with 2 arguments in these 2 ways. Again, you may already know this. In case you didn't, you can call it with function, I mean the name of the function, and then parentheses. And then you can write the first argument and second argument inside. Or you can say the first argument and then the name of the function and then the second argument. And here I have two examples. For the contains function, you have contains, and then you write the first argument inside the parentheses, and then the second argument. Or you can just write first argument contains second argument, and both of them will work fine. So before I start with concatenation, is everything clear that I just explained about the other topics? Okay. So I am going to explain these three ways to concatenate strings or objects. The first one is using the plus plus function, which you may already know. You can concatenate all of these types of data. So you can have, for example, array and array, and it will output an array, or you can have a string and a string, and it will output a string. You can also have time, local time, time zone, and yeah, it's pretty simple to use. You just have to say whatever you want, plus plus the other thing that you want to concatenate. So if you're using it with objects, it would basically look like this. Here in my payload, I have one object, and then I'm creating two variables, which are also two objects. Then on my transformation, I just do payload plus plus new object plus plus new object 2. And in the end, I will see the output with the three objects concatenated. And there's another way to do this, which is using parentheses. So first you have to create the curly brackets, and then you just have to list all of the objects inside parentheses. And it will give you the exact same result. And why does that happen? Because when there are parentheses inside curly brackets, everything that you have there becomes a destructor. And the destructor can have arrays or can have objects. So basically what it's doing, let me go back. It takes whatever is in the payload, which is this, and then it basically removes the outer curly brackets and it leaves the key value pairs floating somewhere. And then it does the same thing for the other two objects. And so you take all of the key value pairs that are basically listed here, and you add another object on the outside. And that's how you can end up with this. But you can't just use the parentheses without the curly brackets because it doesn't work. It will give you an error and it will do whatever you want to do because you can't just have the key value pairs floating around. And so with arrays, you can also do this. If you can see, it's almost the same syntax, but you are surrounding the three objects in square brackets. So the three objects become an array, and then they are destroyed by the object destructor and then put together again. So in the end, you will have the same result. So I'm gonna go back again. You can use the objects in between parentheses and outer curly brackets, or you can use the objects inside an array and then surround the array in the object destructor, which is the parentheses and the curly brackets. Everything clear until that point? That can be a bit confusing. All right. So now, how can you use string concatenation when you are using the $sign and the parentheses? What this does is basically just evaluates the expression that it has inside, and everything that you put inside there can must be able to be casted into a string. For example, you can have here 1 + 1, and it will work, but it will give you a warning because it it is a number and it can be casted into a string, but it's still gonna give you a warning, like if is that what you want? I'm sorry, will what work for an array? You mean this part in the chat? Yeah. Yeah, so this is, yeah, these are JSON objects. These three are JSON objects. So you just put them inside the array and it does a concatenation just fine. I can just change here. For example, instead of saying output application DW, I can just say output application JSON, and it will give you a JSON in the end, but it will work the same way. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, a number operation will give you a warning, but if it won't give you an error afterwards. If you deploy your application and everything, it will work. It's just a bit annoying to see the warning there. So if you want to take it out, you can just write as string right after the expression, and that will work. But you can't evaluate, for example, an array, because an array cannot be casted into a string. So that will give you an error and it won't work if you try to deploy it. So we have the option 1, which is just saying hello world with the string that is right here. And then the option 2, you can also use an object, but I'm saying object dot text. So whatever I have under object text should be a string or a number. In this case, it's a string, so it's working fine. And then the option 3, which is using numbers, which works, just gives you an array. And the option 4, just so you can see that you can also do this with ++, but it can get a bit large to see. As you can see, option 4 and option 1 are exactly the same thing, but using the ++ function, well, you have to concatenate more. So that's why this one is maybe better to use in some cases. So moving on to the null checkers, maybe you have already used this. The examples that I'm gonna give here maybe are not that useful in the real world. I just wanted to be able to demonstrate how it works. So the first thing that you can use is the keyword for default here. So if you have, you want to concatenate two strings, in this case, I'm just gonna concatenate my first name and last name and output a name, which is a concatenation of both. So if I have here just a concatenation with the two strings, I can just do it like this, and I will have my name at the end, Alexandra Martinez. And I am using here the function that we saw last, which is the $sign in parentheses. But in this expression is gonna fail if I send a null in any of these two strings, because it's gonna say that a null cannot be casted into a string, right? So I'm gonna use the first null checker, which is at default. And I'm simply saying whatever string 1 is, just default it to an empty string, and the same for the second string. So if I send here, for example, my first name and then a null, it's just gonna output my first name. And if I say here a null and a last name, it's gonna output just my last name. But there's a problem here that I am concatenating a space. So I can see here in my first name a space, and then on the second option I have a space, and then my last name. So we don't want to have that. And we can use an if else, for example. So I can just come here and say if either one of these is null, then I just want, if it's not null, sorry, if either one of these is not null, then go ahead and put the space. But if either of those are null, then just put an empty string there. So we fix that problem that we had before. But then if I send a null and then another null, it's just gonna send me an empty string. So I think it would be better for this use case if the name 3 was not even shown, if this is gonna be an empty string, right? So what we can do is use an if. So in this case, we're saying we're surrounding the parentheses for all of the name 3. You can see here before starting the field name 3, and then saying whatever function you want to put there or whatever value you want to put there. And after that, close the parentheses. And then you have to say if whatever is not an empty string, then show it. But if this function returns an empty string, then this field is not going to be shown. As you can see here in the output, it's not there. And yes, this looks a little bit redundant because I already know that it's going to output as an empty string. But imagine that you have bigger code and you just have a function here or a variable that it has just so many filters and so many calls to other functions that you don't know if it's going to output an empty string or a null. So you can just say the name of your field and then the name of the function or the variable, and then ask again here if whatever the value of here is null or is empty string, then don't show it. So those are the 3 ways. For this, you do have to have an if else because you are not surrounding a field, an entire field in parentheses, like in this case. I hope that's clear. Let me know if you have any questions until this point. If we remove name 3 and this transformation is exposed to consumer, then they will not know about name 3. What to do about it? Yeah, it depends on your requirements, but let's just imagine that I don't want to show name 3, right? I've had some requirements that basically say if the value is going to come out as 0 or empty or null, then I don't want to see the field there. So that's why I'm showing this option as well, because you can do that. But if your requirement is to show the empty string, the null, or the 0, then you can just leave it like we had before, like this. But yeah, in case you don't want to show it, then you can just surround everything in parentheses and add the if condition.
So does DataWeave output, which is what you're using, does it automatically get rid of null keys?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
Application JSON would normally have skip on null everywhere, equals everywhere to get rid of null keys. But
yeah.
But does application DataWeave output automatically get rid of nulls without any output directive?
So a funny story about that. It doesn't work if you have a function or a variable that has a lot of filters and the filters end up in an empty object or an empty array. So you have to manually add this null checker here for it to work. We've had a lot of problems with that we have application JSON and we have skip on null, but we have just so many filters that it ends up like in empty arrays of arrays of arrays of arrays. And so you kind of have arrays of arrays, but all of them are empty. So we have to do an additional null check here for it not to show, because the skip on empty is not enough. Thank you. Manik is saying that application DataWeave doesn't have that writer property of skip on null. Yeah, Praveen is saying skip on null sometimes do not provide proper response. So I think skip on null sometimes gives random issues if your payload is big. Yes, that is my experience. I don't think they are random issues. I think you just have like a lot of things to work on, and it can get very complex if you have a big payload. So yeah, in case it doesn't work, just by adding skip on null, you can always do this and it works. Okay. So I think that's it from my side. Here are some references. I am going to share all of these links. Here you can see the ++ function and the defaults function. So I guess there are no many questions. All right. Thank you, everyone. I hope this was useful for you. It was very useful for me when I discovered it.